So, born in 1920, meaning 101 years ago, Max Ticktin had a career that spanned nearly 7 decades. He was an acclaimed Hillel rabbi at both the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of Chicago. And for several years in the 1970s, he served as the assistant director of the National Hillel in Washington, D.C. In 1978, he stepped down from his position at Hillel and began teaching in the Judaic Studies program here at GW. And for the next 36 years, until he retired just shy of his 92nd birthday in 2014, Max taught Hebrew literature in all its period, what we used to call from Amos to Amos, from the biblical prophet Amos to the modern Israeli novelist Amos Oz. And in addition, he also taught Yiddish literature and culture, was very much involved in the activities of the DC JCC, and was central figure in the DC Fabernagen, which is an egalitarian and participatory chavura, or a community that was founded back in the 70s and is still active to this day, bringing together joy, of course, is the meaning of the term in Yiddish. All these made him a pillar of the community and a very beloved instructor who inspired countless undergraduates and adult learners alike. But almost entirely forgotten today, but central to the topic of our discussion tonight, was Max Ticktin's courageous decision to join a small group of American Jewish activists who founded Brera, or in its full name, Brera, Project of Concerned in Diaspora-Israel Relations, was an organization founded in 1973, calling for a two-state solution long before it was fashionable. And most potently, members of Brera stirred much controversy in the 1970s by meeting with leading members of the PLO. I'm sure there was not an easy move for someone who, during his youth, served briefly as a courier of pre-state Haganah and was a student at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in the fateful year of 1947-48, together with his wife, Esther. Now, Brera, for those of you who know Hebrew, means choice, but it could also be understood as an alternative, and Max certainly swam against the current of his time. During the first Lebanon War in the early 1980s, Max translated his friend Yoshafat Arkabi's provocative book, The Bar Kokhba Syndrome, Risk and Realism in International Politics, into English. Now, like Brera in the 1970s, Arkabi's book gained widespread notoriety in the 1980s, first in Israel, later on in the American Jewish community, for the parallel it drew between the zealotry of the second century Judean rebel Bar Kokhba, long a central figure in Zionist pantheon of historical icons, and the aggressive brand of Zionism embodied by the then Prime Minister Menachem Begin. A wise Jewish woman once wrote that freedom is always exclusively freedom from the one who thinks differently. Actual credit will be given to my students who recognize the source of this quote. I do not know if Max Ticktin would have endorsed this maxim. Nevertheless, his life and career demonstrated an important fact that is easily forgotten today in the age of identity politics and political partisanship, that one could be committed to the values of Judaism, Jewish culture, and Jewish communal life without turning communal identity into fate and without fearing scrutinizing ideological notions that are regarded as undisputed axioms of the community. As Professor Dan Schwartz, the former director of the Judaic Studies program, put it accurately, Max had the courage to court controversy, yet he did so out of a genuine commitment to Israel and its security, and without flinching away for a second or departing from Jewish life, he was so committed to. Max's warmth and his unpretentious style as a professor made him a beloved mentor to many. One of his former students is Susie Gelman, who studied Hebrew with Max for years. 4 years ago, the Morning Star Foundation, a family foundation established by Susie and Michael Gelman, created the new GW professorship in Israel Studies named after Rabbi and Professor Max Ticktin. I have the honor of holding this distinguished position, and being familiar with Max's story and knowing Max's engagement with Israel, this is, of course, a constant source of inspiration. I believe that Susie and Michael may be in the audience with us tonight. It's always hard to guess on Zoom. And if so, I would like to use this opportunity to thank them for their unique support for scholarship and Jewish life alike. Now, let me now move to introducing our speaker tonight, Professor Mira Sucharov. Mira Sucharov is a professor of political science at University Chair of Teaching Innovation at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Not less important, Mira Sucharov is also an engaged scholar whose scholarly work alongside her provocative essays on Israel-Palestine have made her a well-known public intellectual. She's the author or editor of 5 books, including Public Influence, a guide to op-ed writing and social media engagement from 2019, and Social Justice and Israel-Palestine, Foundational and Contemporary Debates, which she co-edited with Aaron on Tapper, which came out also in 2019 with the University of Toronto Press. Her many op-eds, appeared in newspapers such as Haaretz, The Forward, The Globe, and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Huffington Post, Canadian Jewish News, Jewish Independent, and the Daily Beast. She is a 5-time Teaching Award winner and is the 2019 winner of her Faculty's Excellence in Public Commentary Award. And she's the founding co-chair of Jewish Politics Division in the Association of Jewish Studies and co-editor of the AJS Perspectives, and currently sits on the New Israel Fund of Canada Advisory Council. So in light of Max Ticktin's story, she is especially fitting speaker to join our series. Please join me in welcoming Mira. And tonight we will speak about her most recent book, Borders and Belonging, a memoir that came out with Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. Later on, we will use the chat box also to send you a promotional leaflet in case you would like to purchase the book with a discount. So Mira, now that I'm putting the focus on you, maybe I'll start our discussion first by congratulating you on publishing this memoir. I personally found it's very revealing and courageous. It reveals many intimate details I don't about personal life. I'm not sure I would have been as brave as you are. Your parents' divorce, Jewish life in Canada, your adopting family in an Israeli kibbutz, student activism, and more. And also, it leaps very interestingly in a very non-chronological order to make the historians among us dizzy between events in the 1970s and the early 80s to more contemporary or recent events. So, and I could not fail but notice that probably the longest chapter is aptly entitled Panic. So perhaps I will start us off by asking the genre question, right? Why a memoir? You have numerous scholarly articles under your belt. And you dirtied your hand with writing numerous op-eds and essays aimed towards a broader audience. So what was there something still missing that encouraged you to move in that direction and write a memoir?
Thanks for the question, and thanks so much for having me, Arie, and to George Washington University for hosting me. And just to, it was good to be reminded of Max Ticktin's work in literally translating and then helping bring so many important voices, like Yehush Harkabi's voice, how important that was in shaping my early studies on Israel-Palestine, and particularly thinking about Israeli reactions to foreign policy in the 1980s and the topic of my first book. So why a memoir? I love reading memoir, and I wanted a new challenge in terms of trying to learn and master a new writing form, so what we could think of as creative nonfiction. And it was a really bumpy road to shedding what was really a well-honed expository and prescriptive voice over decades of academic research and writing and many years of op-ed writing. And I wanted to step back from the very prescriptive mode that I'd worked on in op-ed writing, and try to bring the reader into my emotional journey and see where that would take us.
Fantastic. And I could not. I remember that in one of the, I think it was the opening chapter that you wrote. I'm quoting verbatim that you adore this kind of a insider-outsider feeling of, especially when it comes to questions of Israel, and this genre, allowed you also to connect the professional with the personal, but also perhaps it also kind of reveals a split identity. So my question is also, there's several levels of a split identity here. I don't know if you will subscribe to that description, both a split identity in the context of diaspora versus Israel, but perhaps also something that is built into the idea of engaged scholarship, right? There's on the one hand, how can we balance, right, the connection or the tension between our daily occupation, excuse my pun, as professors and scholars. Often we're expected to be kind of a detached, objective, critical distances the value, and the public engagement that sometimes brings with it different expectations. So is it a fair description to call it a bipolar disorder, or is it a creative tension? How would you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the divisions you're tracing are very real, and sometimes they present themselves to us as scholars as real challenges to overcome, and that many scholars think that they should set aside their subjectivity or set aside their so-called personal opinions or they're set aside their political commitments in some sort of in the service of some sort of objective truth. And over time, I've begun to reject that. I mean, certainly when I first started in this business, even from an undergrad, when I majored in Middle East studies, because I was a Jewish Canadian who had been immersed in the Israeli narratives in my tight-knit Jewish community in Winnipeg and my Hebrew immersion summer camp, and I trace all that in the book. And then when I got to university in undergrad, I wanted a broader perspective. So certainly there was this aim of, oh, how can I become objective? How can I shed the subjective part of me and become an objective, more neutral observer? But then over the years, I found that I wanted a way to harmonize all those pieces better. And it's happened over time, sometimes even in my op-ed writing, where I'll bring in my own experiential sense of something. And sometimes, particularly when I'm writing in the Jewish press in Haaretz or Forward or the Canadian Jewish press, I'll want to be writing from a position of an insider position of a Jewish scholar, very much so, speaking to fellow Jews. Other times when I'm on the news, let's say giving an update on the Israeli elections in the Canadian broadcast news context, I'll want to appear very objective and detached and as if I have no skin in the game. But then the memoir really enabled me to merge all those positionalities and reflect on them directly. So I bring the reader into the struggles I face as someone who feels very attached and very connected to the area that she's studying. I mean, my dad's and my stepmom are here in the audience. And I remember when I was around the time, right as I was starting graduate school, my dad asked me, why are you studying? Why focus on Israel, Palestine? Why have you chosen that area to focus on? And I said, well, I don't live in Israel. There were times in my 20s that I thought I would make Aliyah, and I had lived there for a number of years, separate years in my 20s. But since it doesn't appear that I'm going to be making my life there, if I don't study it, I will implode. I felt so connected and so obsessed, I guess, in a way that all scholars often feel obsessed with their subject matter, but I was obsessed in multiple ways, not only intellectually, but emotionally. And the memoir really enables me to trace all those dynamics and the costs that come with feeling very connected to your subject matter, particularly when there's disappointment involved, pain involved, and when your peers don't always see things the way you do.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think beautifully said and beautifully put. It's also, I personally, of course, I think you put the finger on a crucial point that often in discussions about the so-called objectivity in research, we tend to forget an important fact that there's no objectivity in when we study humans. It's not studying a detached manner, the same detached manner we would study a physical or chemical phenomena. But moreover, why do we choose our research topics and research questions to begin with? Of course, I hope that we are not also finding our answers to these questions based on our predicaments and background. And I think that your memoir does it very well. But you also alluded to something that I found very interesting. I think that some of the people in our audience that are coming from the education school are might find it very interesting, which is the way in which, as a student coming to campus, it's not as if you came a tabula rasa. And I think that this is something that speaks to a very important dimension that also perhaps we as scholars and instructors should have more humility in understanding that our students are not coming as empty slates. And also the huge power that thinking about these topics, engaging with these topics comes in or informal settings. So I'm curious if you could say a few words about it, and perhaps it is also interesting to see the similarities between the Canadian Jewish experience and that's probably less familiar to most of the people on this call, and what most of us will associate with Jewish education in the US.
Sure. There's two questions that I heard there. So I'm going to extract them and first talk a bit about my students, and then I'll talk a bit about the Canadian Jewish landscape vis-a-vis versus or in comparison with the American context. So in terms of my own students, I had a tough, let's say a tough awakening, and it's a scene that I recount in detail in the memoir as well, where I realized that my attempt to force my students to check their politics, to check their political commitments at the door, and engage only in what we can think of as detached explanatory questions. Why did Israel do this? Why did the Palestinians do this? Looking for answers the way any scientist would in trying to observe phenomena, rather than evaluate them or express ethical concern. I was trying to force students not to do that. I was trying to force students to bracket those commitments until one day where it all really blew up in my face. And I realized I had to change my teaching approach. And from there, I developed the edited volume that you mentioned with Aaron Hahn Tapper, where we invited 24 scholars and activists to debate these most sensitive questions. Is Israel an apartheid state? Is Israel Palestine a settler colonial model? What about the boycott movement? We invited scholars and activists to debate those sensitive issues in front of the students and in the pages of the textbook. And so that became a really important teaching tool. So I could talk with the students about what's at stake in these debates and let's investigate them. And it was a way of taking me out of the line of fire, excuse these terrible metaphors, and enable me to shepherd the students through sensitive topics that they feel, many of them feel very engaged with. And many of them were more tabula rasa and didn't come with any knowledge about Israel Palestine. But for those that did, I wanted to give them an outlet so that rather than quash those inclinations. So you now asked about Canada. So I'll give you a bit of a flavor of what takes place in the memoir in terms of my Canadian upbringing, and then give you a little context of how that fits into North America more broadly. So in the memoir, I talk about my decade at Jewish summer camp, 11 years at Jewish summer camp, 10 of which were at a Hebrew immersion camp. And it's the only Hebrew immersion sleepaway summer camp left in North America. It's Camp Masad in Winnipeg. And many of you may know about Camp Masad that Noam Chomsky and Alan Dershowitz famously attended at the same time, I believe, though there would be some age difference between them. I don't know of any big cabin fights between them. It would have been at the same, were they contemporaries there? We'd have to do a bit of Googling.
We need to Google it. I don't think
need to Google that.
Davos affair there. That was a struggle of great minds, but it is very telling that two almost polar opposites, Jewish intellectuals, contemporary Jewish intellectuals, emerge from literally the same
camp. And those camps Mossad have in the US have closed. But the one in Winnipeg is still going strong, and it is Hebrew immersion. So what I was raised with for 10 years there was not a self-conscious, explicit Zionism. It was an implicit Zionism. We didn't talk about Zionist philosophers. Now, I spent a summer at Hegemony Dror camp, and I have a campmate here in the audience, Lee Blecker, very lovely to see you here. And he and I were in that youth movement. He was there for a long time. I was there very briefly. And there we had explicit Zionist philosopher discussions, and it was very heady and intellectual. At Camp Mossad in Winnipeg, there was none of that. But what there was a very, very crucial entry into Israeli society because we were functionally fluent, coupled with very strong very strong Jewish day school training in Winnipeg. So by the time I landed in Israel for the first time, when I was 10, on a trip with my grandmother, which I recount in detail in the book, I could speak to the kids on the kibbutz. I went to school for a week or two on my aunt's kibbutz to kind of integrate, and I could speak Hebrew with them. And I really had the beginning of that insider-outsider feeling. And then by the time I landed in Israel for 3 separate years in my 20s, I could engage very directly with Israeli society. So to me, that was so the idea of language, music, culture, Israeli songs, Eurovision, Israeli bands, folk rock, those are the bands and music I listen to now when I need to pick me up. So there's a really kind of a real sensory connection that I was raised with as a child and teen, and I call that a very implicit Zionism. And then it's only, and that would be similar, I would say, as a Canadian or even as an American, where you grow up with certain national symbols, but you don't necessarily investigate the roots of what American identity meant for Native American genocide, or what Canadian identity meant for the Indigenous peoples in Canada, and what it means now for the reconciliation processes going on. So these are things one learns about later, not to mention, of course, legacy of slavery and white supremacy and racism baked into North American society, and particularly American society. So implicit Zionism, which I later wanted to unpack more concretely as I grew as a student and scholar. Now, how does Canada differ from the US? In short, we in Canada are one generation closer to the Holocaust, which is to say that our major waves of Jewish immigration clustered around World War I, whereas yours in the US, majority of Jews started arriving a generation or two earlier. And compare us to Australia, Australia is even a generation later than us. So many of Australia's Jews arrived after World War II. And so the closer I owe a lot of this to the sociologist, the premier sociologist of Canadian Jews, Myron Weinfeld at McGill. The conventional wisdom on this is that if you're closer to the Holocaust generationally, so to speak, even if your age is the same, that on the whole, you may be more conservative. And that is what we see, not in terms of our domestic politics. We have more, we have national health care, and our party system tends to the left of the center of American politics, but in terms of our Judaism. So whereas Reform is the largest denomination in the US, in Canada, it's conservative. Whereas fewer kids, proportionally Jewish kids in the US, go to Jewish day school, more proportionally attend Jewish day school in Canada, more proportionally have visited Israel, more proportionally know Hebrew, et cetera, et cetera. So you could say that on the whole, there's a higher average of Jewish literacy in Canada. These differences will probably even out in another generation or two, no doubt. And even in Canada, there will be less and less take up to Jewish day school as general assimilation trends continue. But that's the situation we found ourselves in. And so we had a very culturally rich, particularly in the cities that I grew up in Western Canada, and particularly Winnipeg, a culturally rich connection to Jewish practice and to Israel.
That's fascinating. It's also really interesting to hear this kind of difference between what you call the implicit approach, immersion in the culture and the language, and the more cerebral, intellectual approach. It reminds me of, when I'm talking with my students in, histories of Zionism classes, I always kind of pause at one stage and tell my students, we are reading these texts very carefully, in a very intellectual way, as if they're philosophical texts. But the great majority of people who turn Zionists, or not the great majority, but a big number of them, received it in a second hand through a counselor in a youth camp, maybe one citation, one quote, one slogan, and then interpretation of an 18-year-old counselor or madrich or madricha. Often it's more impactful when it's done in the woods rather in the classroom, near a bonfire. And it's hard to even reconstruct that in understanding this kind of the pull and the power. And I think that there's something to be said about it. And I think that in a way also the memoir speaks to that in many ways. I'm curious also, returning to the Canadian kind of a perspective, if there is such a thing as Canadian perspective, we probably should problematize this as well. If perhaps terminology that might seem as extremely explosive, questions of truth and reconciliation, questions of settler colonialism that often are seen as almost explosive in many North American circles, come more naturally. I always joke with that with my students that, after paper cuts, mentioning settler colonialism is probably the biggest risk that comes with my profession. You never know who would take your words out of context and put you in a blacklist because something that started as a paradigm in, a scientific language, of course, also functions as an axis of a politically charged discourse, and it's seen. Right. So I wonder if you can speak to that. I mean, if there is something about this perspective that maps onto Canadian questions, dilemmas, sensitivities that perhaps makes it qualitatively different, or is it, or are you in that respect, the detached academic that is simply using a scientific paradigm, and all the rest is demagoguery?
I regret to say that I am no more insulated than you are from those occupational hazards. And I will give you, and though I think it's not only unfortunate, but it's also a bit ironic. And it's ironic in that in Canada, we are more and more, I think, faster than you in the States are. Of course, I'm supposed to be there right now, right? Before the pandemic, you had invited me to be there in person. So I wouldn't be saying you. I would be enjoying being in DC at the GW campus. So I just have to note that little pandemic disappointment. But we in Canada are let's say, X number of years more advanced in coming to terms with our settler colonial past, I would say, than the US is. And there's a lot of reasons for that, partly because Native Americans were the indigenous peoples in south of the border were decimated even more. Also, immigration from Mexico and connections there, legacy of slavery. There's a lot of additional elements that have occurred in American history and continue to occur till today. But we in Canada are engaged directly in a process of what we call reconciliation. It's an odd word. I don't necessarily like the word, but it's the word Indigenous peoples want us to use. The reason I would say I don't like it is because it sounds like, it sounds a bit like Rodney King, like let's just all get along. And of course, it's not about whites and Indigenous getting along. It's about what settlers, Canadians owe the Indigenous peoples, but the word is reconciliation, so I will continue to use that word. So we're very much engaged in a truth and reconciliation process, owing from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A lot of it is focusing on restitution for residential schools that Indigenous peoples' children were forcibly taken to, abused. Many of them died at the hands of settler leaders of these schools. The church was very much involved and implicated in this. So we have a lot of work to do, and we're working on it in Canada. So sometimes when I'm speaking to a Canadian Jewish audience, as I did one day in one of my columns when I held a regular column in the national Canadian Jewish newspaper called the Canadian Jewish News, sometimes I try to make a comparison between the kind of work Israel can do vis-a-vis the Palestinians with the kind of work Canada is now doing vis-a-vis its Indigenous peoples, meaning I try to use that comparison to give hope that no one's throwing settler Canadians into the sea, no one's quashing the idea of a Canadian state. We're talking about how to rearrange power such that we can move forward in a more just way. But when I do that, or when I did that in that particular column, it didn't go over well. Now, partly it was because for the first time, the editor of the paper had decided to take the word occupation, which I used frequently in my columns, meaning Israel's occupation of the West Bank and quasi-occupation of Gaza. We can discuss that later. For the first time, the editor decided to take the word occupation that had appeared often in my columns and put it in the headline. Because remember, when you write op-eds, generally, you as the author don't write your headline. Generally, that's the editor's job. So the editor chooses the headline, and he chose to put the word occupation in headline. I had no problem with that, but the readers didn't like it. And such a brouhaha ensued that I ended up resigning. It's something I talk about in my book, and it's something that our wonderful Jewish studies colleague, David Coffin, who has a wonderful new edited volume out right now that I know you know about, Arie, on Jews in Canada. It's something, it was an event that he even has discussed in an academic article that he's written in an academic journal about Canadian Jews and Indigenous peoples. In other words, it became a bit of a thing within Canadian Jewish circles. So trying to use the settler colonial model to explain what goes on in Israel-Palestine is no easier in Canada.
It's a very telling. It's more than an anecdote. It's a very telling story, and you also tell it very well. It also reminds us that perhaps one of the only advantages of the dire times we live in is that growing segments of the public and as well as the media magnates on the one hand would want more professors from the humanities and social sciences to provide the perspective. But on the other hand, as this episode you tell so well reveals, there are, again, pardon my pun, occupational hazards here. And sometimes that won't fly very well. And I think that it's fascinating to see this, again, sort of a tension between the two registers, between writing to the general public. I am curious whether, even to hear what would be your kind of a mental preparation when switching gears and almost code switching, when preparing yourself to talk to a public. It's a very different zone, so to speak, than writing a peer-reviewed academic article that will be read and maybe torn to pieces, but by academics, by fellow academics, by peers, and this kind of a larger public, and how even one can do that, because on the one hand, I think it's wonderful to see more and more engaged intellectuals, engaged scholars who are speaking outside the, so to speak, ivory tower. I don't think ivory towers exist anymore. But on the other hand, it does come with new type of tensions and risks. So I'm just curious, what's your method? Do you meditate? Do you do Zen? How one, makes this kind of a code switching?
I do some mindfulness exercises in my teaching. So I do sometimes do that. I should probably do that a little more with the Israel-Palestine class. Lately, I've been thinking of it. I don't know why, but for some, I think I know why. I've been doing it more when I've been teaching race in racial dynamics in everyday North American society, particularly with the racial awakening that's occurring now, high time for that, of course, and social media dynamics. And I guess I assume students are all feeling more implicated in that. Whereas when I teach Israel-Palestine, even though there are many students who are connected, as I talked about before, it still does feel farther away. It feels like something over there that we're watching. But I do some meditation, yes. Now, how do I prepare? It depends on the audience, on the planned audience. And I've gotten some pushback for this. I've discussed this on social media at times about, and someone said there's no such, about adapting one's message depending on the forum, the public forum. And someone said that's silly, there's no such thing as an inside voice and an outside voice. And I said, well, there sometimes is, because if we're writing in the Jewish press, or if I'm speaking at a synagogue or a JCC, the message might be a little bit different than when I'm speaking to an NGO that's devoted to Palestine solidarity. It might be a bit different if I'm interviewing a Palestinian member of Knesset for a column that I'm then going to write. When I say interview, I'm not a reporter, so I don't just interview like a reporter does. I interview for then taking their ideas and building my own argument, making reference to their ideas, of course. So I think the audience matters. Now, I will say that when I do a fair bit of broadcast media, meaning the national television station wants someone, as I said earlier, I gave the example, to speak on the Israeli elections or to speak on a new Hamas-Israel Gaza war. Hopefully there won't be another, but when there have been. And there I view my role as more unfortunately superficial translation, factual translation, just to give the audience, the Canadian audience, a quick, couple minutes sense of what's going on. But only once did I move, and I planned this a few minutes earlier. I knew I was going to do this. I didn't surprise myself, but I do notice it's rare. Did I give my strong prescriptive opinion? And that was after Israeli snipers had shot dead multiple Palestinians who were rushing the fence from Gaza. And at that point, I said, our prime minister, meaning was it under Justin Trudeau? Now I have to remember exactly the year, but whoever our prime minister was at the time, meaning Canada's prime minister, must speak out. And I did make a personal political declaration based on my sense of morality and ethics. But usually I don't do that in broadcast for whatever reason. Usually I save that for my op-ed writing.
That's an interesting question. Interesting question. In what times do we fall in the we switch from I to we? I think that this is, I'm not necessarily saying bad or good, but there is also a tension, and sometimes I feel, in going and engaging with the public, especially in the context of Jewish studies and Israel studies, and an expectation, implicit or explicit, that you will be the one speaking on behalf, right? In that respect, I'm always, I tend to avoid doing this. I was never appointed. No community turned me into their rabbi or spokesperson. And there's this kind of famous Mark Twain witticism about only kings, presidents, or people who have tapeworms speak in a we. So unless there's something that is burning, I personally would prefer avoiding the we. But it's interesting at what time, a normative ethical stance requires that we, and it's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the things I found interesting, and you are the only one that really spoke to it, is also part of the uncharted territory we entered to in the last decade or so, has to do also with different media. So switching gears, for instance, from, conventionally, the intellectuals will have the magazines, the journal, the highbrow journalism, as it was called, and print press. Now we have an even a second layer of social media. So what, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, pros and cons, switching to social media as a form of engagement.
Yes, I mean, I was what we call an early adopter. I'm convinced, I'm probably wrong about this, but I'm convinced that I was the oldest person on Facebook when I joined in 2006, because there were only 20 million users at the time, and now there's what, half a billion, I think.
That was a small, intimate village then, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone knew it.
And I really value what social media I mean, social media has its many pitfalls, and it can be a swamp, especially certain platforms over others. But I value the potential of social media for really creating a town square. And what I really value when I'm able to do it well, and I'm not always able to do it well, but when I am able to do it well, I value bringing people together and hosting tough conversations. And some people say, why are you arguing with so and so, or why do other people keep arguing with so and so, and you're never going to win, you're never going to convince your interlocutor. And that's usually true. But what I want to remind people is that many other people are watching and listening and learning when two people are duking it out, if they're duking it out in a good faith way, where they're bringing evidence to bear and sharing experiences and observations.
Yeah. Your answer also kind of reminds me of the section. It's not only a chapter, it's several chapters that you included in your earlier book. Actually, I have the copy here, as I might as well also flag it out, or in Social Justice in Israel Palestine, you co-edited with Aaron Hunt Topper on narratives, right? We spoke about it when prepping for today, about kind of the limits of narrative approaches. I personally, I don't know if you would agree, see that on the one hand, I came from this kind of a tradition in which good liberal education is all about showing two sides to every coin, multiple narratives. We need to bring the other voice to the table. Often I sense, either again implicitly or explicitly, that this very premise is challenged, right? That there's something about the age we live in, or it has to do perhaps with the specific toxic nature of Israel-Palestine, that the very assumptions of this kind of a narrative approach are questioned. So I was wondering what type of, both as in experiences from the field, type of pushbacks you might have sensed, and but also using your other hat as sort of a social scientist, how would you approach that kind of pedagogical question of this older, maybe naive way of saying, let's present as many sides, as many angles, as many perspectives on the subject as possible?
I love teaching both perspectives, meaning I love teaching a narrative approach, and I love teaching or introducing students to the criticisms of a narratives approach. And that's actually one of the things I most enjoy teaching, is that very first class. And I'll just get others up to speed who haven't been as immersed in the debates about the debates. It's really about the debate about how to teach the debate. So if a narrative approach is, here's how Israelis or Israeli Jews think about 1948, and here's how Palestinians think about 1948. And if you keep doing that often enough, here's Israelis call the war that occurred in June of 1967, Israelis call it the Six-Day War, Palestinians call it, I guess, the 1967 war, or the Naksa. Similarly, War of Independence, or the Nakba for 1948. It can seem like, if you keep doing that over and over again and you don't do anything else, it can seem to some critics that you're tracing a moral equivalence, and that you're ignoring the factor of power, and the factor of power disparity, and power differential between Israel, the state with a first-class military, and the Palestinians, who are very much don't share that kind of material power and don't have sovereign statehood. Though, I mean, we can go on the one hand, on the other hand. On the other hand, of course, some might say, well, they're backed by many Arab states, and so therefore the power is more equal than you think. Well, we could hash that all out as well. And so what I really like doing is telling students, some people call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and some people don't like to ever say the word conflict, because again, it's similar to when we're thinking about studying racism in the US, or race. Do we call it race relations, or do we call it race and racism? And I would say that now more of us are probably thinking of it in terms of race and racism and don't like the term race relations because, again, it implies, oh, blacks and whites should just get along. How can we all get along better? And that, of course, isn't the major issue. The major issue is power, oppression, marginalization, systems, structures. So people who view it that way will want a different lens, will want that kind of lens applied to Israel-Palestine, will be people who view it that way might be more likely to embrace the idea that Zionism is racism or that Israel's an apartheid state. So I want students to be able to unpack those ideas and to see where those different views come from. But I'll never altogether throw out a narratives approach because I'm totally, I just feel very psychologically, I feel like the collective memory and the collective psychological experience of peoples is so crucial in understanding all sorts of things, and understanding how they understand the present is how they understand the past. And so when you think about what narratives ultimately are, they're stories. So I will want to teach Palestinian poetry on the first day of class, and I will want to teach Israeli Jewish poetry, and I will want to look at films from both sides. But again, these are phrases that can get you into trouble, but from each collective group. And one last hazard here too, if we keep saying both groups, both sides, two groups, the other, of course, challenge is not to homogenize each group and treat each group like a monolith, even if we acknowledge or agree that Israel has a lot more power than Palestinians. We still want to do enough work to break up open up the black ball, the billiard ball of each group, and see what's going on inside, and see the various contestations that play out within each group too.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And before we open up for an open Q&A with our audience, I was wondering if you would be also willing to speak about other form of public engagement. You were very central at sort of around the Me Too movement, about perhaps a feminist perspective or criticism we need to bring to the table. You were very much involved, and are still very actively involved, not only at the AJS, in topics connected to our academic culture. What would be perhaps the vital perspective or vital conversation that we're still missing, or we just started to have, about our not only scholarly life, but how we think even about Jewish studies as a topic, as a field, both for teaching and for research?
I think that there is a lot of increasing awareness right now in Jewish studies about questions of power and questions of hegemonic narratives, which assumptions have been central and which assumptions need to be, I guess, problematized or held up as not the only way things are done. So whether that's the reduction of manels, all male panels, that's been a large move in all of academia over the last decade, to egregious conduct, to how people conduct themselves at conferences and elsewhere, to the opening up space for it as co-editor, I guess, to talk about my hat as co-editor of AJS Perspectives, the outward facing journal of Jewish studies, opening up space for what Chaya Halberstam, my co-editor, and I really want to do is open up space for younger scholars and all, actually not just younger scholars, all scholars, to be a bit more vulnerable. The unfinished issue, it was called the unfinished issue. That was the theme. That was really exciting how people came forward and said, here's a project I've been working on for decades that I never finished, and here's what happened, or here's a job I haven't gotten and I'm still a contingent faculty member, or here are my struggles. And so wanting to open up space for people to be more vulnerable, and I think opening up space for vulnerability can then enable a culture of recognizing when power needs to be chipped away, because people aren't as much in a constant defensive crouch, and whether that power is unacknowledged whiteness as the norm, unacknowledged Ashkenazi identity as the norm, unacknowledged gender assumptions as the norm. And I guess that's and I guess that's what I've been trying to do with my memoir is bring, and my teaching is bring vulnerability into open conversation with power.
Right. No, that's a great closure, right, of that journey. And I cannot agree more. There's something that is desperately needed, especially in our time and age, that we're branding ourselves and are encouraged only to demonstrate our achievements and create this kind of a very successful image, especially on social media. And of course, every academic knows it, and that behind our official resume, there's a long resume of the failures and the things that we didn't accomplish and the project we didn't finish and the numerous fellowships we applied to and were rejected. And whether we live in an environment that allows us also to speak about that and not only to be the kind of this macho successful academic. So I want to open the discussion to the audience. So once again, I encourage you to either use the raise hand function and feel free to unmute yourself and discuss and talk. I think it will be even nicer than simply reading out the questions from the Q&A. So I have one question from Jill Jacobs. Jill, I can read your question, but if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself and simply joining the conversation, please feel free to do so.
Sure. So thank you, Professor Dubnov. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Sucharov, what is the distinction between colonialism and settler colonialism? Just as a clarification, because I'm not entirely clear. Does the distinction really matter, particularly when talking about Israel-Palestine? And does one or the other or both apply, in your opinion?
Thanks.
And why?
Yeah, good question. The general distinction is that in traditional colonialism, you have a core that is geographically separate from the colonial outpost. And so people from the core go to the colonial outpost, kind of take its resources and people sometimes and kind of export that back to the core, to the metropole, to enrich the core. And so if we think of colonial powers throughout history, often being in Europe, and they were kind of extending their tentacles out to places outside of Europe and enriching themselves that way. Settler colonialism is different in that the people from the core end up staying and living their lives and creating communities for life, let's say, in the new place. And so Canada is a perfect example, US, Australia, New Zealand, and maybe Israel, but it depends who you ask. So in some ways, the Zionists, the European Zionists, were external to the land, coming from Europe and building lives, but other Zionist Jews had been there for generations. And still, and a third way to look at it is that Jews historically had started there. So Jews weren't entirely a foreign transplant the way they were to Turtle Island, which is the indigenous name for North America. Jill?
Can I interject one other thing? Is that Jews were not really accepted as full Europeans. And I think, and they weren't, I mean, I think they were, I don't know that it's that much of an argument to say they were the great other. They were yet refugees from Europe, even because they were Jewish. So I think that's another layer of it, is it's not just the claim of indigeneity, it's also how European were European Jews. You know, certainly my ancestors would not have said they were Polish or Russian, they were Jewish, and they fled from there. They ended up in North America. But I mean, I think that's also kind of a complication in terms of using that definition.
So when we think about Zionism, you're absolutely right that it isn't simply that they were excited about a new place and a new adventure, that there were very, very important push factors, the push of anti-Semitism, the push of persecution, pushing them out of their homes. So, and that's the idea of Jews being a diaspora people and not being always feeling or settled or safe, and certainly not being settled or safe. And never mind the spiritual pull, whether you're, you know, but yes, physically Jews and my ancestors were the same as yours, though we landed in Canada. So for sure. And so it's complicated. And so the book that I did with Aaron Tapper, where we have people debate whether settler colonial model is the best model, we didn't think it was intellectually fair to say it is settler colonialism or it isn't, because I think the scholarly consensus is that you can say it is, and you can say it might be, but it's not really necessarily intellectually fair just to say it isn't outright. So what we did was both sides sort of agree that settler colonialism, that there are elements of settler colonialism, but the person who sort of disagrees with it more says that a better model is competing nationalisms. So that's what we're looking at here. So I think it's better than just saying yes or no, and better to be, rather than being so binary about it, is looking for elements of truth in the different models that seem so contested these days.
It was also very interesting, if I could then interject, to see that and again, it's compliment for you as an editor. You didn't fall prey to the instinct of saying, let's choose a Palestinian to defend the settler colonial paradigm, and then choose an Israeli to say that it's debunked. Actually, an interesting chapter is actually written by an Israeli scholar defending the settler colonial paradigm, which also kind of problematizes this in many ways. But I see many hands, and I want to allow students to speak. So next in line is Bennett Patel.
Yeah. So I grew up in a Jewish household, and obviously I was surrounded by different viewpoints and arguments relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I was just wondering, like, when you get students in your classroom that have absolutely no idea, where do you begin teaching about the conflict? Like, what's your starting point?
I start with poetry, as I mentioned, so that I can get students right away engaged in some of the symbols and sensory aspects and memory aspects for each dominant group. And we do a lot of, and then they have a textbook to rely on for the facts. I mean, of course, all history is contested and no two historians always agree, but the general chronology of the events. And then we watch a lot of films, like actual feature films, to give a sense of different emotional moments that are being contested in each society. We read a lot of op-eds. So what's an Israeli politician arguing for? What's a scholar arguing for? What are activists arguing for? So I try to ease them as much as I can into the facts of the matter, so that once they kind of have a basic sense of what happened when, then we look at the issues that are most debated. But it's hard. I'm like you. I also grew up kind of knowing a lot about this stuff. So it's hard for me to picture what it would be like to know nothing. And I have a lot of admiration for my students who are learning a lot of the basics very rapidly and quickly, but they seem to do well with it.
Thank you. So next in line is Camille, and then Vita and Tracy.
Hi, thanks for talking with us. My question kind of relates to the previous one about curriculum and teaching students. So how do you combat literary hegemony? Because I think that there are obviously a lot of different narratives, and especially within Israeli society, like there's Mizrahi and like Haredi Mizrahi and all of these different kind of like, I don't want to say like sects, but there's like a lot, it's very diverse. So I was just going to ask how you kind of pick and choose, and maybe how you acknowledge that a lot of like the histories and narratives have been probably erased or silenced in a way.
You're absolutely right. And there's awareness more and more in all sorts of social science and humanities courses to really examine and re-examine our course outlines, our syllabi, and see whose voices are we prioritizing and whose voices are we leaving out. And so it's a constant challenge and opportunity to make sure we're bringing an array of voices in. That said, I mean, my first book, which my students read, or I hope they read anyway, which we rely on a lot, actually does the opposite of what you're saying. But I think there's a good reason for it. But I talk about that with them. And in that book, I really talk about the hegemonic narratives of Israeli Jewish society. And so we don't get into a lot of those subgroups, and we don't get into a lot of that contestation, because there's a purpose. Something I do in that book for the argument, for the purpose of the book, is to look at what happens when a state's actions in the 80s, in this case, go against the hegemonic identity of the state. But I can't only rely on that book. I also have to make sure I'm bringing in other voices. And the Social Justice in Israel-Palestine book I think does a good job of that, bringing in Mizrahi voices, Bedouin voices, Palestinian, and different Jewish perspectives as well. But yes, it's an excellent point. And I think the term, if you're looking, you probably know about this, but to do more research on this, is the idea of decolonizing our syllabi. And I think we're all working hard on that, and it's a big process. Thank you.
Vita, you're next.
Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. So my question is from a little more of a practical, like conflict resolution standpoint. I'm wondering if you can speak to or have any thoughts about how like academics working in this field of Israeli-Palestinian studies of the conflict, how they can like maybe contribute to a less toxic culture, or are they contributing to the culture, or is it the wider public? So maybe if you can speak to a little bit about that. And just kind of curious if maybe they're a group of this conflict that's not addressed, in terms of like peace, reconciliation, if academics need to be more involved or less involved, or if you could let me know. Thank you.
Important question and big question, and I'm probably not going to do it justice to do justice to the entirety of your question, but I will zero in on something that I think is useful to think about and to follow. There's a debate right now in terms of peace. First of all, as I talk about in my book, peace is often now considered a dirty word, sort of like we talked about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And peace is sort of summed up in that idea versus anti-oppression, anti-occupation. But in that whole umbrella idea of peace and peace building, there's a debate now between coexistence movements and peace building on one hand, and co-resistance movements, co-resistance. And in the latter, the groups, the Israelis, in this case, the Israelis and Palestinians who are going to come together in a dialogue or a joint action, need to pledge under the co-resistance model that they a priori oppose the occupation, support, well, self-determination or independence, depending on one state, let's leave that aside for a moment, but support human rights and the collective well-being of the other. And that only until you do that, co-resistance people say, we won't sit in dialogue with you. We won't just do, let's all get along coexistence ideas. So you might have seen or heard of or even participated in peace camps where Israelis and Palestinians come from Israel and Palestine and come to a summer camp in the US. The most famous one was Seeds for Peace in Maine. I'm not sure if it's still going on currently. These are very controversial. Because the idea is, let's just put Israelis and Palestinians together and they'll learn to get along, versus the co-resistance model. So that's something. And I also want to flag our colleague over at University of San Francisco, Oren Kroll-Zeldin, who's writing and researching on this distinction right now. So check out that. And the other way to look at it, if you want to do some research on this, is the debate over normalization versus anti-normalization. So on one hand, normalization, peace building, dialogue. On the other hand, coexistence. On the other hand, co-resistance, anti-normalization, anti-occupation.
And if I may interject, it's also, I would even add to the equation, which is perhaps due to my profession as a historian, so the numerous memory activists. And one can think about movement like Zochrot, that one of their slogans is sort of a desperate truth and reconciliation cannot be done. So at least we'll have truth without reconciliation, sort of a flashing out and the historical narratives that were omitted or pushed aside, which is of course not less controversial than any other type of social and political activism. So next in line is Tracy, and then Jacob.
Hi, so my question was just concerning what you said about how you resigned from something because of the response you got from using a certain title in your one of your writings. So I was just wondering, how do you write freely about this topic of like the Israeli-Palestine conflict when it's so like easy to be publicly scrutinized? And like, is this a thought that you keep like in your mind as you write, and does it impact what like certain remarks that you make, or does it impact what you end up writing?
Yeah, good question. And I see it in the chat, and I thank you for that. Yes, you need, for this kind of public engagement, you need a thick skin, but you also need to be willing, or I also need to have learned to listen and react not defensively, but thoughtfully. And I haven't always done it as well as I should. And I don't even necessarily defend or think it was the best thing for me to step down. I mean, I think I would say, if I looked at myself honestly, that there was a bit of peacocking involved in that. And I think I got some extra leverage out of it, mileage out of it. So I know there was a little bit of a self-serving aspect to that. But on the positive side, it generated an important conversation, I think, in Canada and elsewhere. I wrote a piece about it in Haaretz, and so really thinking about the occupation. So sometimes good things can come of it. But yeah, and in the book, in the memoir, I talk about times where there's been a big fallout from a piece or two I've written, and it's been painful. And the other thing I like to encourage people to do is to look at where does the criticism most hurt? From your left or from your right? So is it, if someone more conservative than you criticizes you, how do you feel? If someone more radical or more progressive than you criticizes you, how do you feel? If people in your own camp are progressive criticizing you, how do you feel, depending on where you situate yourself? And that can be a really insightful learning process for helping refine your own thoughts and your own political ideas.
Excellent. Jake, please.
Hello, thank you very much for joining us. It's been great to hear everything you've had to say so far. And so my question is just basically how your perception of this, of Israel-Palestine, of the whole conflict in general has evolved over time, whether or not like you have the same perspectives now as you did when you were studying in school, or how moving to Israel, researching this topic and writing your book has sort of influenced the perspective that you currently hold regarding the topic.
Great question. I would say I've shifted a foot or two to the left of where I'd been, and I trace this in the book, although I'm not super explicit about this in the book because I'm not trying to bring anyone on side. I'm not trying to persuade people. I'm not trying to persuade people that they should take a particular political action. I want them to relate to my journey, even if their journey is quite different. But I can tell you, and you could Google my columns and look at them over time in my op-eds, and you could see what I'm about to say. So it's certainly not a secret. I've moved a foot or two to the left, but the big question is that partly because of how things have changed in Israel-Palestine? And what I mean by changed is not changed. So when I was your age, I stood and it wasn't cool to have televisions. I'm sure you don't even call them televisions anymore, but whatever those metal boxes are, it wasn't cool to have them. Remember, Lee, when we were in undergrad? Although you were at a cooler place than I was for your college experience, but it wasn't cool to have TVs, but one of our friends had a television. I was at McGill. So we went in downtown Montreal and we stood around in his apartment and we watched the signing of the Oslo Agreement. It wasn't called the Oslo Agreement quite then. It was called the Declaration of Principles between Yasser Arafat from the PLO, Yitzhak Rabin from Israel, with President Bill Clinton pushing them together because neither of them really wanted to shake the other's hand. And we were ecstatic and we thought, wow, this is a new era, a peace is upon us. So we were very optimistic. Since then, things have not gotten better. And in many ways, they've gotten worse. So is it because things have gotten worse that I've become more pessimistic and therefore wanted to see a stronger push and reaction out of, let's say, diaspora Jews and those who support Israel? Or is it because I personally have moved left? It's hard to know. But I definitely have since I was in undergrad, where at the time I would say I was a liberal Zionist. Again, we didn't use those words as much. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Lee Blecher, and then afterwards, Elad Raymond.
Thanks for taking my question. I'm going to ask a question from a different angle, actually. Since I'm not a social scientist or an academic, I read your book from the side of, hey, I'm an old friend Dr. Sucharov. And I actually found it interesting that in a good way, to me, this book was a real mix of a very academic approach in this format of a memoir, which is very personal. And I actually wasn't expecting an academic work. And I don't know if that was your intention or it just happened naturally, but it was, I actually thought I would read this book and just be like, nod my head and really enjoy it and get through it. But I found myself having to stop very often to ask questions, and like, it does what an academic book does. And I didn't know if your intention was to do it that way, or if you were just writing this from the heart and it just, because you're an academic and this is how you write, it just happened that way. And I do know that you did a lot of studying on how to do a memoir. And so my second question is, how much of your writing was intentional and how much of your writing was from the heart?
Well, I definitely had to learn to reduce the expository voice and reduce the sort of pedantic voice, and increase the narrative arc and build in narrative and storytelling tension. So I wouldn't say that I intended it for it to sound academic. I mean, I guess I would say if this sounds academic, then let me send you some articles in the recent issue of International Studies Quarterly and see what you make of that.
Well, I think
I wanted it to be accessible and I wanted it to be relatable.
I think what I meant is that I was expecting almost like a real personal, and it was, but I could tell that I mean, I know this is not a dense academic book. It was much more entertaining. But I found that I was surprised in a good way of how it came off to me.
Yeah, I mean, I am who I am, right? So you're gonna get all the parts of me in that book. You're gonna get the scholar, and you're gonna get the camper and the counselor and the anxiety sufferer and the divorced child and the teen who struggled with panic, and the adult who struggles with panic. So you I guess you picked up on those various elements of me at different times. In terms of writing from the heart, I mean, one thing that my writing mentor told me, I worked with various mentors, one of whom was Shulam Dean, who wrote an excellent book about his journey leaving ultra-Orthodoxy. And one of the things he emphasizes, you need to write from scars, not wounds. That you can have emotion and anger, but it has to be calibrated just enough so that you're bringing the reader in with you, but you're not overwhelming them. So it's a delicate dance in that way, in terms of the heart metaphor.
Great book. Go look at it.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you. So next is Rod Raymond.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. My question, which I've also put in the chat a bit ago, it kind of alludes to something that you've been touching on throughout the talk, but I kind of wanted to ask it more directly. So of course, over the years, especially since the collapse of the peace process, we've seen great divergence between views in the North American Jewry and in Israel, and on all kinds of different topics. And I'm just curious to what extent you see that, to what extent that has influenced your work, and kind of how you see that trend continuing to shift moving forward.
Another good question. I think where I would focus our attention is in looking at how the Israeli electorate has shifted. So when I went to live in Israel when I was 20, for the first of the 3 years I spent there, the 1992 elections had just happened. And I remember my uncle picked me up from the airport, and he had, in Israel, you have little, lots of like little car, like Arie, you know about this, like little car accessories. So people have like little garbage cans in the back. Like I really need that now. And our family car could really use a lot of accessories, but they had like a little Meretz garbage can. Actually, that sounds terrible, as if Meretz is garbage, but it was like just swag that you had. And Meretz was the left-wing peace party. They had 12 seats, 10% of the Israeli parliament, of the Israeli Knesset, was devoted to the Israeli peace party. Now they're lucky if they pass the threshold. I can't remember how many seats they got in the last election.
Four or five.
And so there was a heyday. There was a sense that that Israel, the electorate was moving towards agreements with the PLO, towards negotiations, towards concessions. And since then, the electorate has moved consistently rightward. However, with some exceptions, the Arab parties in the form of the Joint List had a really strong showing. The head of those parties, of that Joint List, Ayman Odeh, is fairly well respected in Israel in many corners. So in that way, I guess people like me in the diaspora feel more and more alienated from Israel, the electorate. That said, so I also feel very connected to Israel, the culture. And someone at one of these talks had asked me, I think they even asked me afterwards because it's too painful a question to ask me in public, but I'll pose the question without giving an answer. But I guess another way of putting this is there a point at which I would feel so distanced from where Israel is that I would no longer feel all that emotional connection? And that's, I think, something we all have to ask ourselves. The other thing that different views between, so partly there's a difference in views between North American Jews and Israeli Jews. The other is that with social media, there's more of a permeability, and we in the US and Canada can see what Israelis are saying, particularly if you read Hebrew. We're all on the same networks, which is pretty exciting. And that's a new phenomenon. Whereas before you would have to tune in to an Israeli, figure out how to tune into the Israeli radio or find a way to stream Israeli TV. Now we can watch the same clips, the same comedy clips that they're watching the next day, the same television ads, election ads. So there's a little bit more connectivity between the two societies, but really important to know Hebrew to really get in there. So study your Hebrew.
And study Israeli humor, which is very dark. I'm so glad that we have this lively conversation. I will give, I'm looking at the time and I don't want to exhaust you, but I will give the last question to Grace. And while I'm at that, I would turn your attention to the fact that I've used the chat box to share with you the discount flyer in case you are interested in purchasing the book. So you can, you're supposed to be able to simply download that flyer and the discount code that it is on it. So Grace, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being here. I look forward to reading your whole book once finals are over. But yeah, what you were saying about the difference between the sort of inherent or implicit Zionism that you learned from your experiences at summer camp versus like this theoretical Zionism. This conversation really made me think of how recently in sort of the popular vernacular of like campus Zionism, there's been this idea that Zionism is decolonization or something sort of equivalent to that. And evidently, if you look at the early literature, that's sort of a problematic statement. So I guess I'm just wondering if you think that implicit Zionism versus theoretical Zionism conflicts within you particularly, and also if Jewish institutions were teaching young people about the theory and history of Zionism, that young Jews would feel better able to engage productively with the discourse around Israel and Palestine.
On the latter question, absolutely. And actually, I mean, I do have a small research study to look at that. I look at my time at the implicit Zionism camp, which was a decade in Camp Masat. Well, actually, I'm not supposed to say the name of the camp. I forgot. I don't use the names of the camps just so that the book didn't appear like an advertorial. But anyway, that's the camp. And in the Habonim Dror camp that I went to, where it is much more explicit, and I see how the graduates of Habonim Dror movement are engaging in quite nuanced and active and wrestling style ways with contemporary Israel-Palestine. So I think the more knowledge is key. Knowledge is power. That's so cliche, but knowledge is a tool with which to engage, and then you marry, you bridge the knowledge with your political ethics and identity, and you can create change. So now it's not that I never had the intellectual Zionism either. So after all that implicit Zionism and living in Israel, I started taking a course like Professor Dubnov's, and I took that as an undergrad. I think after I'd lived in Israel, I came back in fourth year and took it my senior year. And then I was just hungry for all those thinkers, and A.D. Gordon and Ahad Ha'am, and I could taste the apples that they're, I guess it wouldn't be apples. Give me a sweet fruit, Arie.
Sabra.
What?
You have to take off the thorny part if you want to really eat the sweet part of the sabras, right?
Yes, right. So peel away the sabra fruit, and now of course grapefruits, pomelos. There you go, pomelos. That's a good one. So you taste the pomelos, and I could taste it in the earth and the sensory experiences of these pioneering labor Zionists. So, so sometimes you read the intellectual stuff and it's filtered through an affective attachment. And if you grow up in a Jewish community, center dominated and synagogue dominated youth, and you attend Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day celebrations every year, and March for Israel's and celebrate Israel parades in New York, and eat falafel and listen to music and have a very celebratory sensory experience. By the time you read those thinkers, you might still be filtering it through that connective attachment, and that's okay. You just sort of have to be aware of that. So I guess it's not a linear process, but more knowledge is always better. So take Professor Dubnov's courses. I guess you already are.
With such an endorsement, how can I, famous last words, right? But no, I would refer to the penultimate sentence, right? Power is, knowledge is power, and knowledge is important. Without, we can debate endlessly, and one can use numerous cliches about the Jewish Seder table, which is basically a constant debate between that aunt and that uncle and that former relative. So debate will be there with us, and will continue, but at least we will have an informed debate that is based on some knowledge, and not only opinion. I think that this was an extremely fascinating evening, at least for me, both to understand the personal voyage, but also the predicaments and the dilemmas today. I'd like to thank also all the members of the audience and the students for joining us this evening, and for having such a lively and productive discussion. And I look forward to seeing you in our future events. Good luck to all my students and all students in general, as we're reaching the last brutal end of this very, very challenging semester. The good thing that from here we can only climb up. And thank you, for taking the time, for writing such an interesting and thought-provoking memoir, and for this very engaging conversation.
Thank you, Arie. It was a pleasure, and to all the wonderful questions. I really appreciated all the sparks for thought for my next book.
Fantastic. Take care. Good evening, wherever you are.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.